Old school.
Hello and welcome to the Reach Out podcast. I'm Stu Whiffen. Joining me always, Kirsty Eaton. How are you?
I'm good. Monday morning, sun is shining. Got a fantastic guest on today. All excited.
Wonderful. Well, tell us who today's guest is, Kirst.
So today's guest is John-Barry Waldron, who I'm trying to think of how I found out about you. I think it was word of mouth. And then I did a little bit of research, and then I found out about the incredible podcast that you do yourself, which you're going to tell us more about today. So welcome. Is it John-Barry, JB?
You can call me whatever you like. Normally, if I'm in trouble, my mum calls me John-Barry, but everybody else just John.
Just John. Lovely. Well, thank you so much for coming on today, John.
No problem. Yeah, really glad to be here. Yeah.
John, if you had like a kind of little sort of bio that would be a few lines, should you have a Wikipedia, to give listeners a bit of a kind of insight and introduction to who and what you do, how would you best sort of approach
that? So I describe myself as a mental health nurse primarily. That's my first job. But secondary to that, I did a podcast featuring some of the patients I work with. So it's called On the Ward, and I suppose that's what I'm most known for. Is the podcast was featuring some of the patients I work with in a secure psychiatric hospital. So that's where my main job takes place. And I think there's a huge amount of stigma, but also I'd say a bit of ignorance, and people aren't really aware of what happens in psychiatric hospitals, except for what they see in Hollywood films, which is still the case now.
So is that what led you to wanting to do the podcast? Was to
exactly,
kind of set the record straight in full?
I speak to friends and family and things like that, and they say, "Oh my God, how do you put up with having to put the straitjackets on and things like that?" And I said, "We don't do that anymore." And people, and I never blame people for having that image or that thought in their head, because I don't think as mental health professionals we've been quick enough to show what hospitals are really like. I think we're very reluctant to kind of show, for good reasons, confidentiality and things like that. And we want to, everyone has the right to go to treatment and not be remembered, but also we also want to show people what it's really like. I think people have that, like I said, the notion in their head sometimes can stop people from coming forward if they think that that's what it's going to be like.
John, we always start the podcast asking every guest the same question, and if was to say to you the words mental health, what's the first thing you think about?
If I'm going to be honest, I think at the moment it's become a bit of a cliche. So I think it's great. So my line of work, I would say I work primarily with people with mental illness. So serious mental illness, people have got really unwell. And I think mental health is more like physical health, like something that we all have and we all need to maintain. But I think it's become this kind of thing where people just talk about it, but nobody seems to do anything about it. Does that make sense? So we're in a place now where I think everyone is told to talk, told to open up, but yet we still don't have the provisions available when people need help.
What do you align that to? Like government infrastructure, or like where do you see that? Because obviously, for many years now, and it's a good thing. People have been, hammered home with every celebrity on the planet telling you it's okay to talk and it's good to talk, and that's great. But I can't remember who it was, Kirst, that we had on maybe 2 or 3 episodes ago. But it's more about like signposting now as to, well, go here, and is that equipped to cope with huge amounts of people that then sort of get signposted and head over to sort of these organisations? Like, what do you align it to sort of go back to the initial question? Do you see that as something that the government needs to focus on? And
100%. So I suppose there's 2 things going on. So one is that we're far more aware. So there's far more awareness now. People are aware if they've had issues and things like that they can come forward. But at the same time, we're reducing services. So over the course of the last 10 years, everything's gone down while people are going up. So demand is going up, services are going down. It's just a recipe for disaster. But like I said, there is a sort of an element, I think, where we have these awareness campaigns, which are great. And I really do, I don't knock them at all, because I think they are great that people talk. But then I think they're used as like a way to get away from doing the hard stuff. So the hard stuff is putting money into the services, right? So you've got to put money into it. Like I know you had Alistair Campbell on last week and I listened and it was really interesting. But I disagreed with what he said. He said it doesn't take throwing money at it. I think we do need to throw money at it. We need to throw a lot more money at it, and we're just not putting the money and resources into it. Sorry, something knocked over there. I was making such a profound point that my cupboard fell over. But no, I do. I think you can talk, you can skirt around the edges, and you can help a bit. But really, you just need more money, and we need more nurses, particularly. I mean, I think you might come on to it later about what's changed over the course of my career, if you like, or over the 10 years that I've been in it, is that there just isn't enough staff, right? So there's just not enough nurses. We're down about a fifth of nurses. There's a fifth of nursing vacancies in the NHS. So there's just not enough nurses. And I think we kind of sometimes get blinded by the numbers. You're like, 10,000 nurses down or 12,000 nurses down. But what does that mean like in reality? In reality, it means that people aren't going to be able to get the treatment that they want. So I suppose if you went to McDonald's, you're supposed to have 10 staff and you're 2 down, that's only 8 staff. So everybody else is going to have to work extra hard to do the stuff. To kind of stretch the analogy a bit, what tends to happen then is if you get 100 people in and they all want different burgers and different stuff, you're just going to make them the same thing. And I think that's what's happening with the NHS. Because they're stretched, they'll just go, right, everybody gets CBT. So that, everybody can have a bit of CBT because we know it works for a lot of people. Everyone's individuals, right? And everybody's got different problems. But it's because they don't have the resources, they can't give the individualized stuff that they should be doing.
But I mean, to play devil's advocate, I think, what we do, before we started to become a placement provider for counselling students and offering free counselling, we were a befriending service for years. And one of the campaigns that we're running now is called Man Down. And the idea behind that is to increase awareness with everybody, take the onus of responsibility off of the person who's feeling suicidal and pressuring them to talk about their problems. If we all became a bit more kind of suicide savvy, I like that. We'll fit that in somewhere.
It's alliteration as well. That's very good. It's very good.
Yeah. But to make others more kind of suicide aware on some of the language and some of the kind of subtleties on what to pick up on, for them to then have the confidence to be able to start that conversation and actually ask someone who they love and who they're concerned about, listen, I've noticed, you're not right. You're not your normal self. What's going on? Are you thinking about taking your life? Talk to me.
I think that's
it doesn't
important.
necessarily, it doesn't have to always go back to hospitals and to nurses. It doesn't have to go back to a clinical approach. I think, the catchphrase, it takes a village to raise a child. I think if we all take more of a responsibility towards our neighbours and our loved ones, maybe we wouldn't be so reliant on primary care services and statutory services. That's just what I'm saying.
No, I completely agree with you. And I think to bring it back to the podcast, if you like, is part of it is to make people not so scared of serious mental illness and serious topics. So as you said about suicide, I think with a lot of the awareness campaigns, everybody's kind of quite happy to talk about anxiety and maybe low-level depression. But when it gets to like serious stuff, so if people have psychosis, I still think people are really cautious about talking to people with psychosis, or what do I do if my friend is making strange claims and being paranoid and things like that. And so we're improving, we're switching the dial, but maybe we haven't got to that end of the scale.
Yeah, no, I think so. Tell us a bit about your first experiences and how you became to be a mental health nurse. So you started out living in Runwell Hospital, didn't you?
That's right. People get confused. I wasn't an inpatient, but I was. Both my parents worked. They're both Irish. They came over from Ireland, and at the time, one of the perks was they would put you up in accommodation, but the accommodation was literally in the grounds of the hospital. They had staff street essentially, like full of staff in, and so I was always around people with mental health problems. You used to see them wandering, about in the grounds and things. And I always remember specifically, my mum used to say, at the bottom of our road there was like a mini roundabout, and to the right was like the main road, and to the left was the hospital. And she'd always say, "Go left," because she'd much prefer me hanging around with people with mental health problems than the road, which is really dangerous.
So yeah, I was to Wickford.
yeah. Only bad things can happen there. No, but so I was never really scared or intimidated, I guess, would be the thing, by people with mental health problems. Saw them quite often, and saw people talking to themselves and hearing voices and responding to things that weren't there, and just treated that as like, well, that's obviously they're not very well, and not to be scared of it is the thing.
How old was you at this point?
I was 8 when I first came over. And we left that street when I was about 16, maybe 17. And unfortunately, they've knocked it now. I mean, that's progress, right? But they've kind of completely knocked Runwell Hospital altogether, really. There's only one small unit left there. But it used to be, I don't know if you remember it, Stuart. I don't know if you're old enough to remember.
I do, yeah. Very
but even for me, like, I'd go to school and say that's where I lived. And I would get like, oh, my God, that's where all the nutters are. And that's where all the psychopaths are. And so you would get them images. And I remember vividly people saying, so, older people would say like that's where you get sent if you were bad. You get sent to Runwell Hospital. And so I never had that impression. I never had that stigma, I guess, because I lived it and I knew that it wasn't true.
And the experiences that your mum and dad had of both being mental health nurses, did they come home with any kind of stories? Obviously, they decompress together doing the same job.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. And quite often they take me there. So there'd be Christmas parties or some sort of parties, and they'd take me on the wards. So I would just go on the wards and meet the patients and meet all the staff, and it was never kind of thought of they were never segregated. So I think that was the big difference. I think now it's kind of like, I understand why we do it, but we kind of segregate these people off to be kind of farmed away in like some sort of secure hospital. Whereas back then it was a lot more open, a lot more commonplace to go and see them, go and talk to people. But they did. They used to quite often talk about their experiences and things that happened to them on the wards. Not all of them good, but at least then I suppose it prepared me, I guess, psychologically in a weird way for when I started.
And so it was just always going to be a natural progression that you would then become a mental health nurse yourself?
Absolutely not. No, I completely kicked against it. Went off to university and did geography just to kind of escape it, I guess, or just kind of, I don't know, when you're young, you try and do the opposite of what your parents do, right? You try and get away from it. But then eventually I think I left university and kind of fell into being a support worker. And even in that sense, I was like, well, I'm not going to be here long, so don't give me any projects to do because I'm not going to be staying very long. And obviously 10 years later, I was still there.
Gets under your skin, doesn't it?
It does.
Well, I mean, to sort of bring it forward to now, did you, and I'm going to sort of ask you in a moment to sort of tell us about a sort of an average day for you now. But, and I know you said that you listened to the Alistair Campbell episode, I think on there, when he was talking about his brother's illness and in the 80s, and referencing Cuckoo's Nest and Nut Ass and Looney Bin and all of these sort of terminology that still exists, to certain generations, and I'm sure you know that more than any of us. And was the podcast something that you set up to sort of kind of a peek behind the curtain that, hey, it's change your perception of how you view these places?
100%. So one of the main drivers, I guess, was and again, like I said, I don't blame people for having their opinions because that's all they see. We had a disco, so the patients wanted to do a Halloween party, right? And so
can I just say, my first time I ever went to Runwell, I was 17 and I DJ'd a party at Runwell.
Well, there you go. Well, we needed you because when I rung in my new hospital, and to be fair, it's secure, so slightly different, but we rang around 7 DJs in the local Essex area, and they all knocked us back. They all said, no way, I'm not coming to the psychiatric hospital, no way. And the guy who did come, he came and he got to reception, and when we get to reception, we give people these little kind of alarm things to pull, if they get in trouble, we had trouble on the wall to pull the alarm. And he said, what? He said, I didn't realise it was this, no way. And he left. So there was no music for the for the patient's Halloween party. We had to have like a little Bluetooth speaker. And I thought that's pure, again, I use the word ignorance, but maybe that's not the word, but people just being unaware of what the hospital was like. So they didn't have any music for their disco party. Interestingly, I retell this story a lot, but I told this story when I was doing some radio show, and the lady who was interviewing me said, oh, that's awful. But then she said, are they allowed to do Halloween parties? And I went, what do you mean? And she went, well, won't they, if they dress up, won't they get, I don't know if she thought they'd get extra mad or they would, lose their minds, or, she, again, innocently, she just thought, oh, I didn't think they'd be allowed to dress up. I had one lady ask me, what did she say? She said, oh, it's Strictly Come Dancing, that's one. I love Strictly. And I said, all right. She said, are they allowed to watch TV in there and things? And I go, well, yeah. It's like, but again, not for any malice or anything like that. I think they just don't know. People just don't know. They've never been in them. But I think what we're going to find is, particularly with the, probably COVID is going to affect a lot of people in a lot of ways. I think a lot more people are going to have a lot more experience of mental health units, either them or their family. And we need to kind of break it down a bit because people are going to have to get used to them.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, we'll get back to the podcast, but tell us, and I know I'm generalizing by saying tell us about an average day, but what is the average day for somebody who does what you do?
Well, varied, I would say, is one thing. But what I would say is I'm in kind of a period of transition. So where I used to work, I want to be vague enough that I don't want to get in trouble. But basically, where I used to work was exceptionally busy, and where I work now is not quite so busy. But where I used to work, an average day would be, I vividly remember, you'd go through periods where you'd be exceptionally busy. So when I say busy on a mental health unit, is meaning that there's a lot of patients trying to harm themselves, a lot of patients in distress. Sometimes they're trying to hurt other people. And I remember when we went through really busy patches, like really, kind of traumatic periods, we'd have patients literally at 7 o'clock. You'd have the handover at 7 o'clock. At 7:30, they'd be banging on the door. And then one of them would try and headbang on the wall, and you'd have to try and stop them. And this is literally the first moment of my day. I have to deal with that patient, trying to help them, maybe give them medication, maybe try and help them in some other way. That would get you through to about 9 o'clock. So this is like literally 7 o'clock, 9 o'clock, you're dealing with that patient. 9 o'clock, you've got to do medication. 10 o'clock, some of them might have ward rounds. That means you've got to speak to the doctor, talk about their treatment, their long-term treatment. In between that, I think I was saying to Kirsty, and I don't know if you'll have a warning before this, but we get a lot of patients tying ligatures. That was like a really kind of common occurrence. So common occurrence would be someone would tie something around their neck, and someone would have to go in. We'd have to cut it off. We'd have to help them, and then talk them down. Again, therapy, maybe talk to them, medication, all these kind of things. I would describe it as like we were like the A&E or like the emergency services of mental health care. So it was more like we've got to keep these people safe, and there was lots of things we'd have to do to keep them safe. But in between that, so I'm making it sound really dramatic, and what I find very hard with the podcast is in the podcast I'm trying to show people it's not probably as bad as you think. Does it make sense? Like the environment is not as crazy and as the thing that you probably think in your mind, but also sometimes it does get really busy, and sometimes there are really serious things that happen and you have to deal with them, because the patients wouldn't be there if it wasn't very serious, the illness that they have. Sorry, I've gone off on a rant there. So where was I? We're about 12 o'clock, then we have lunch, and then about 1 o'clock. So in between, there would be various different therapies going on. Sometimes the patients would be in a good place and they would go to them. Sometimes they're not in a good place and they can't go to them. They would often have visits when they get well. They'd often have visits off the ward, so they'd go to town, or they might go and visit their family. Again, bring it back to the podcast. We had a patient who went to visit his family. I can't remember where he lives, up north somewhere, maybe Nottingham. So we drove miles. And often when they go first, a member of staff would have to go with them just to keep them safe and keep everything monitored. And I remember we met someone they hadn't seen in ages, because sometimes they're in hospital for a long time. And the guy said to him, "All right, mate, I haven't seen you in ages. Where you been?" And he said, "Oh, I've been in prison." And he didn't want to say he'd been in psychiatric hospital, and I asked him on the way back, I said, why did you tell that guy you'd been in prison? And he said, "Oh, you get less questions if you just say, I've been in prison than if I've been in hospital." So that's, again, another, illustration of how the stigma and stuff, it carries on. And it does affect people, it does affect them day to day. So sorry, I'm not answering your question very well.
No,
you are perfect.
What a day in the life is like. I'm
perfectly. You've literally got to lunch, and you've mentioned several things that I guess that the person on the street would see as highly traumatic. And as much as that's your skill set is to deal with that and work with that and help that. Experiencing sort of trauma like that, how do you manage it when you get home? How do you sort of deal with what you've had to,
Well, I guess like all of us, I don't think I handled it very well, during the pandemic. I think everyone was really struggling. And so the normal things that I would use, like going out with friends, maybe having a drink, going to cinema, exercise, whatever, when that was all cut away with COVID, that was very difficult, very exceptionally difficult. Yeah. And I think you learn to talk. That helps a lot. I probably bore my wife endlessly talking about various different things. But also at work, we have psychologists and therapists there that we get the opportunity to speak to. But I still, even with that, I think it does affect you. I think over time, they say with them particularly type of wards, they say really you should only be working there for, a year, 18 months max, because of the trauma involved. But again, we've got a shortage of nurses. There is no nurses available. So, I was there for about 4 years on this ward, which was too long. Looking back now, hindsight, I'm now working in a place where I don't have them sorts of incidents. Where I work now, I work kind of addiction therapy, and it's a lot more therapeutic based, and the patients are not quite as what's the word, serious, or their problems are not as ingrained as where I was before. So now I've had that break, and I look back on where I used to work and think, like you said, yeah, God, that was very traumatic, and having to deal with that a lot. But I'm making it sound probably more dramatic than it is, because that's not every day. So one day that would happen, the next day they have a really good day where a patient might go out and see their family, or might go and visit their kids that they haven't seen in years. And that's like, them sort of small moments are the ones that are going to get you through the 3 months of bad moments. Does that make sense? Just seeing someone who hasn't seen that, like I said, I saw people see mums and dads they hadn't seen for years. And another thing, again, I like to talk, so you'll have to, I don't know if you've got good editing or what, but another thing I think is, I never blame anyone, because mental illness is really difficult, and it's sticky, and it's horrible, and things go wrong, and people do drop out of their lives and things like that. And I would never judge a family member for not visiting or losing contact, because it is really difficult. I only see them maybe now when they're doing quite well, but I haven't seen them for the 2 years, when they've been really abusive, or they've been drinking, or they've been trying to hurt themselves. I only catch it at the end. And so I wouldn't blame any family member for being reserved about coming to visit, and things like that. I think that's something we need to get across as well, is that, mental illness is really tough for the people around the people that have got it, and obviously tough for the person who has it,
Definitely. I mean, I was going to ask, you were talking about the headbanger, when you were given the example of the day. And for those that are, continuously trying to ligature. Can you give it just a bit of a broad overview of, these, for the most part, people aren't necessarily born this way.
No.
It's a lifetime of trauma, isn't it? That
Oh no, 100%. Yeah, and I would say that the patients I deal with are the most extreme end, I would say, of the trauma. But yeah, all of them would have had horrific experiences when they're younger. To read through some of their histories is like, it's just, it would break your heart. It's some of it's almost Dickensian, the stuff that they went through, and that would be the number one fix if you wanted to stop people getting into such mental trauma, is stop abusing kids when they're young. And I'd like to think we're getting better at it, but I don't know if we are. I think it might be getting worse. But yeah, that would be the it's just simple. Just stop abusing kids, and you would have far less problems when you get into older age.
100%. This is, I mean, someone said that to me when I first started working within mental health, that I think it was around about 85-90% of all mental health issues, particularly those, towards the more severe, are down to childhood experiences, adverse childhood experiences.
I wouldn't doubt it. And like I said, it would seem simple to stop that, but then you get into a whole society and social thing, and I think when you spoke to Alistair Campbell, you talked about social prescribing and things like that, and I think that's so important, that social services stretched, police are stretched, every aspect of the safety net for people is completely gone, and if we fix that, we'd solve so many problems.
It is.
We're still going to have people with mental health problems. You're going to have people with mental health problems. That's going to happen. Okay, it doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, but the extent of them, we could definitely change.
And I think if we take it back to the community level and even a family level, so you guys were both saying that, we've got all these awareness campaigns about it's important to talk, it's okay to talk, but people don't have necessarily a mental health nurse to speak to, or they won't go to their GP. With what we do, we are actively advising people to just talk to anyone, talk to your pal, talk to your wife, talk to someone, call the Samaritans, in order to avoid people escalating to the point where they do need something like a statutory service.
I think what you're doing is really inspirational, because the themes that come out of the podcast, the huge thing that comes out is they all talk about, obviously, medication helps and therapy helps and things like that. The one thing that all the patients say is the connections they make in the hospital is the big thing. So the human connection, right? And so Samaritans is great, but if you can see someone in person, it makes a huge difference, just to, offload. And I think the big thing that people miss, and like you said before, is that it doesn't have to be a huge in-depth, right, my father when I was 5 did it. It doesn't have to be huge stuff. Like the thing that everybody missed during the pandemic was getting on the bus and saying, cheers, mate, or going to the coffee shop and seeing the go, all right, yeah, nice weather. We missed that connection, and I think during the podcast they all say that the human connection is the thing that helped them the most.
I mean, this is why group therapy is so fantastic. But I mean, everyone that I ever worked with, you know, if you try and proposition the idea of group therapy, it's like, no, don't want to talk to anybody.
Yeah.
Everyone else is a nutter. I'm fine.
Yes.
Don't want to share my business. Don't want to air my dirty laundry in public. And you're like, just give it a go. Just give it a go. I'll go with you. I'll walk you there. I'll wait outside for the hour. I promise I'll be there when you come out of it. Just give it a go, please. And they come out and they're hooked. You know, it's such a fantastic space just to be amongst other people that have a shared experience. Like you say, you don't have to go to the nitty gritty of what happened. You can just say, my childhood was shit. And at 12 years old, I ran away, started dating someone who was like 16, got into drink, got into drugs. You know, these, like, we kind of, you know, you can join the dots and put the pieces together yourself.
Well, it's
but
like
just having that shared experience is so comforting.
Yeah. Well, like AA is one of the most popular things, and the reason it is because it works.
Massive
right?
advocate.
Done it for like 70 years, and it still works. Just that being able to share the experience and go, actually, somebody else is also doing similar stuff to me, you know. And there's a huge part, particularly with addiction, about shame, and you know, and people get shamed and think nobody could possibly be as bad as me. You know, I'm the worst thing that's ever lived. And when you go to these meetings and you hear that other people are having similar experiences, that it helps. Yeah.
Definitely.
One of the things that in regards to, you know, talking about human connection, I'm going to pull it back to the podcast now, because often, like, the podcast industry is something that I'm very much involved in, you know, outside of this podcast as well. And one of the things that I often sort of tell corporates that are looking to launch podcasts is, like, you could sit in a meeting with somebody and that you're trying to pitch for business or whatever for an hour, and it will be a meeting. But the minute you sit down with someone, and I'm sure you understand this as a podcaster, and put a microphone in front of them and say, tell me about your situation, tell me about the connection you get there is worth 30 business meetings. Like, because you get something when you put a microphone in front of somebody and you look at them and you ask them to tell you all about themselves, and you listen. And I think there's so much positive stuff that can come from the kind of evolution and the boom in this, you know, this media. I think it's fantastic. I mean, do you agree with that?
I 100% agree with you. And look, without getting too Hollywood and too cliche, is when I first sat the first patient down, episode 1, got him talking, and he explained somebody's story, and I recognized this is actually too big now. I can't not get this out, because he's taken the time and he wanted to get his story out, and he talked so like movingly. I was like, I have to get this out now. I can't keep it to myself because it's so important. And all of the patients were like, we want to tell our story to help other people. It was never about like, I want to do this because I can show off that, you know, this. It was more like, I want to put this out there. And I think you're right. There's a huge thing about, we miss stuff now, don't we? There's not much tangible stuff, like a meaning where we're like, this is something that we are part of and we've done it, and you can listen to it whenever you like, you know.
And importantly as well, if you look at music, TV, and certainly the younger generations, their thumbs are very rapid, and their attention spans are getting shorter and shorter. I work at a venue in Rayleigh. We mentioned Rayleigh earlier before we press record, and witnessing the generation that are coming through now that turned 18 during lockdown, that didn't have the experiences that perhaps us three did, turning 18 and being able to go to clubs and stuff like that. What I see now is when I play a record, they go really crazy for 1 minute. and then they pull their telephones from their pocket because their attention spans, and I'm generalizing massively here, you know, and it's changing. So to bring this back to podcasting, what I'm saying is, in, you know, music that you hear now, they're hearing it on TikTok for 30 seconds. And, you know, Netflix and so many things are getting shorter and shorter, more bite-sized. And I think that's why podcasting is so beautiful, because it's long-form conversation. It's not being condensed down to you know, 3 minutes that, you know, you can stomach in your day. It's like, no, this is a beautiful distraction. You can hear somebody literally pour their life and soul into a conversation, uninterrupted for 30 minutes, an hour, you know, however long. And I think that's a really positive and beautiful thing that podcasting offers.
I completely agree with you. And I think also we need to be mindful of the impact it has on the person delivering the chat. So the patients, all of them spoke to me, and they were all so grateful and so thankful that I took the time to record them. And then the thought that other people were listening to them, give them such heart. You know, like I said, that guy who, the first chap I met, every time I see him now, he goes, "Oh, John," he said, "we're up to 10,000 now." He said 10,000 people listening. And he, we had a tweet from Russell Brand, although Russell Brand's gone a bit off. But anyway, before that, he, you know, retweeted the podcast saying, you know, yeah, man, that's my jam. He'd listened to the podcast, and he had printed this tweet out now and keeps it in his pocket. And every time I see him, he pulls out and goes, "Oh, John, remember Russell Brand? He listened to the podcast, didn't he?" And I said, "Yeah, you know."
To be fair, I would probably do that too.
Yeah. So just the sense it gives them, like a sense of pride, you know, that they've talked and they've listened, and that people are listening. That's the big thing, that people are actually listening to them speak. Because I think a lot of their lives, they're kind of, I wouldn't say
they're
forgotten
dismissed.
about, but dismissed, a bit dismissed. And I think 100%. I said to you, Kirsty, when I said to you, I think the image of hospital, particularly, so sometimes these guys are in hospital for months, years sometimes, but the image is that life stops. So you go into hospital because you're mentally unwell, everything stops, and in 2 years' time when you're back out, you know, life starts up again. But it doesn't really work like that. They're still doing stuff in there, you know, they're still volunteering and making music, and obviously they're unwell, so periods of up and down, but they're doing stuff while they're in hospital as well. Life just hasn't ended because they're in hospital.
What made you want to do the podcast? What made you think, why do you think it's important to get their opinions and their feedback of what it's like to be an inpatient?
I guess, as we something broadly discussed before, that when I was younger, it was always about, oh, the nutters, they're mental, they're lunatics, and it's always used as like a slur. And if ever you watch any movie, Hollywood film, it's always like some evil psychopath murderer has got mental illness, you know. What's his name? Mike Myers escaped from psychiatric hospital, you know. So they're always painted as the worst of the worst. Probably even worse than criminals, I would say, is that, God, you don't want to be mad. You don't want to be like these people, you know.
And I thought that Ratchet is the most terrifying, you know, film bad person ever.
Yes.
Baddie.
And look, I One Further Cookie in this is one of my favorite films, but it was nearly 50 years ago now.
Yeah,
you know?
Absolutely.
And we still have people now come and go, "Well, I don't want to go to hospital. It's like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest." And I said, no, we've moved on from that. And people are worried they're going to get lobotomized and all sorts of stuff. But and again, I don't blame people for having that image, because that's all we've shown them. But I can't remember what I was saying. But yeah, these evil characters, or the worst characters, are always the ones that have got some sort of mental health problem. And even, what was the latest one I watched? Just before I started the podcast, is it Joker? You remember Joker, the movie Joker?
Oh, I watched that for the first time a few weeks ago. Yeah.
And like a brilliant film, great. But he's portrayed in that as having a mental illness, like he has a key worker and things like that. And you've got probably the most evil genius like in the world is portrayed as having a mental health problem. So again, they definitely get the bad end of the stick.
So what was it like when you decided that you wanted to create a podcast, that you wanted to get inpatients' views about it? When you first started asking patients, "This is what I want to do, what do you think? Would you be up for it?" What was their response?
Overwhelmingly positive. Like,
really?
I was terrified. So we have like a meeting where we go, and I think it's every couple of months, or every quarter, they bring all the patients from various different regions, and they all come and they all have this big meeting. And I just presented it to them. I said, "Oh, look, I was thinking about, you know, maybe doing a podcast where people would talk about their story and things like that." And they all of them said it's such a brilliant idea. One of them was saying that she said her family won't come and visit her because they think it's like Silence of the Lambs. You know that movie Silence of the Lambs, where everyone's wearing like a mask and they're in cages and things like that. And she said, "Oh, if I could do the podcast, or if they could hear something, then maybe they wouldn't be scared to come and visit." So I mean, like, had practical implications as well as, you know, hopefully affecting society or whatever. But it was more like, if I can just give it to that person's parents, then maybe they might be more willing to come and visit, you know. So take it on a really low level, really kind of just, that's what I wanted. Just wanted people who were interested could listen to it and go like, "Oh yeah, okay, maybe it's not as bad as I thought." On the counter flip to that, I realise now that obviously with cuts to services and things like that. Some of the hospitals are becoming really overwhelming and things like that. So I'd like to think it's not showing them to be perfect, and it's not showing them to be as bad. Maybe somewhere in the middle.
You mentioned the impact and the positive impact that it's had by people that have guested on the show. Like, how have you found it?
Oh, I love it. Like you were mentioning about what do I do in terms of like my own trauma. So obviously having to see these things and see, deal with patients that are really unwell. For that period of my life, there was just before COVID, we were going on doing radio interviews and things like that, and appearing on other podcasts, seeing people on Twitter and getting emails and things like that. That kept me going. That kind of stuff where you're like, oh, people are actually interested and people are listening. It does. It really makes a difference. It makes you proud and makes you like, well, yeah, I will go in tomorrow and try and do the best I can, So yeah, it had a really positive impact on me. Obviously, then COVID happened and everything stopped. I think I can blame COVID for the. So I always said, like, your trajectory is kind of going like this. So we had BBC 5 Live had said they were going to come in and do a live broadcast from the hospital, to show off the podcast, and they'd send people down to do recce's and things like that. COVID happened, everything stopped, and then it all kind of just disappeared. And obviously, that moment is gone. But I could see like a way where it could have elevated to something bigger than it was. Does that make sense? And it kind of, and like, poor me. Like, lockdown, there was lots more serious things happen than that. But it was very sad that it was just unfortunate that this huge, massive world event happened that affected my tiny little podcast.
So what are some of the kind of standout examples that patients have given you of some of the things they love about living on a ward? Some of the positive takeaways.
I'd say they, like I said to you before, the community is the big thing. So they've made friends, and a lot of them are there for a long time together. They've made friends for life, So they've made people that they know that they're going to keep with, and I've had patients leave and go and set up and live with patients they've also been with. Does it make sense? So they go and get shared accommodation and things like that. The problem with the ward is not the problem. Sorry, the good thing is that it's a very stable place, and they feel safe when they're in there. And
so coming home sometimes can be a bit traumatic and they don't want to leave.
Precisely, yeah. And I think that's a big thing we're missing. Again, like you talked about social prescribing, is that when people leave hospital, sometimes they're going back to where they came from and maybe not in the best kind of circumstances. So if you're in a hospital and you're cared for and you're being seen, you're safe, and you go to maybe a bed sit where you're getting 60 quid a week, you might see your nurse once a month, things are going to, that's where things are going to go wrong. I think
you've lost all those social connections. You've lost people that are keeping an eye out for you.
Yes, and I think that's a big thing we're missing, is that the leaving of hospital is kind of again, not for any fault of the patients and not really for any fault of the staff. There's not enough resources out there. I mean, we're really busy on the wards. In the community, times by 10. So there's community nurses are having to have like 50, 60 people on their caseload. They're just not going to be. They're not going to be able to see them, right? We're going to see them once a month. You just can't fit them in the day. And so so that's a big thing. I think on the ward they enjoyed if you listen to the podcast, they all talk about when they feel like they're not being therapized, that's when they enjoy it the most. So when they go to do music, or they'll do sports or whatever, and while they're doing it, they might say, oh yeah, I had a really difficult time with my dad and trouble, and they'll talk. It will be therapy, but they won't recognize it as therapy. So like doing music, and like we had a studio there where they were kind of making their own music and things like that, and stuff used to come out in the music, but they wouldn't recognize it as therapy, because if you sit someone down and go, right, we're going to have a talk here, you're going to tell me your problems, it's very formal, people kind of close up a bit and think, I don't know. But when you're like doing the random stuff,
that is the magic of occupational therapy.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. And I work with some really fantastic occupational therapists, yeah, even doing people's nails or their hair or whatever, that just to get them out of that zone. And then you'd be amazed,
just feeling like a human again, like someone who has value, taking pride in their appearance, like actually I do matter.
You say that, Kirst. We had a great example of that. Was we had a fellow gent from Essex called Stuart Roberts, who set up an amazing organisation called Haircuts for Homeless, and he's expanded it all over the country now. And he says it resonated a little bit with something he said earlier as well, John. And he said, like, sometimes these people that are on the streets, haven't spoken to anyone for a week or half a week, or whatever it is, and they come in and say they probably haven't been touched for weeks. And he said, and I sit there and I'm engaging with them and talking to them and touching their head and cutting their hair, and
incredibly intimate.
And what he says really surreal is they'll walk down the street before they have a haircut, and people generally sort of form their own, low opinions of them a lot of the time. Just the simplicity of a haircut makes people feel they look at them slightly different, and the value that must bring, to feeling like part of society must be incredible. And it's something as simple as a haircut,
But yeah, it's a huge thing to them. That's the big difference. Huge thing to them. And sometimes I'd imagine with the haircuts and things like that, it's the inner pride that they feel. So people might look at them the same, but they feel better. They feel more confident, and they're like, had a haircut, I'm ready for action.
And they've spoken to someone.
Yeah.
And yeah, absolutely. And in regards to the podcast, and I guess this is a strange question. It's like picking your favourite child. But if there's people that are considering listening to the podcast now, John, would you say, look, go to episode 1 and start there? Or would you say, do you know what? This episode really encaptured everything that I set out to achieve with the podcast. It gives a really good insight into what we wanted to do when we come up with this idea. Where would you say listeners should go to?
Obviously, I'd say 1, just so you can get a bit of a broad idea of what it's all about.
That's where I started. Yeah.
I think I can't, and I'm terrible with this. I should know. There's one episode. I think it's episode 4 or 5. I can't remember. But the patient talking talks about their experience, and he's kind of he's a bit of a geezer, gangster type person. But he said he got hit by a bus. So he got hit by a bus when he was younger, and it caused a profound brain injury in him. And he says it's the best thing that ever happened to him. And I asked him on the podcast, what do you mean? And he said, well, I was going down a path, where I was criminality, and I was, carrying knives and things like that, and getting hit by a bus. I realized that I've got to rely on other people, and that, the path I was going was the wrong path. And that, really, it's incredible to have someone with that story and end up in a psychiatric unit. So he had mental health problems as well as all the other stuff. But without getting hit by the bus, he feels he wouldn't be able to be where he is now. And that to me was like, a wow moment, I guess.
We'll put the link to the podcast in the show notes for any for listeners now. So obviously, when you finish this episode, go and check out, and obviously subscribe to John's podcast. And
I'd say subscribe to this podcast first, and then subscribe to afterwards. This one's very important.
So are you not doing the podcast anymore, John?
Well, we've taken hiatus, I would say. So as I said, where I worked before was what I was trying to get across was working in a secure hospital, and I don't work in secure setting anymore. I work in kind of more, as I said, addiction services and people that are, I suppose, to broadly put it, to simplify it, the patients I worked with before were sectioned, so very kind of unwell. The patients I work with now are not sectioned, so they're
involuntary patients.
Voluntary patients, precisely. But I could talk for hours about some of the problems that are going on.
I was going to say, could you do a podcast in your new environment and get those kind of opinions and experiences?
Potentially. I wonder. It's interesting because ironically, I think the people that are sectioned are more likely to talk than people who are not, because maybe they might be going back to they're probably going to be staying very long, so they might be going back to their families or back to their workplace, and there might be some trepidation, because as we said at the start, people are far more willing to talk. But there are limits, sometimes people are like, I'm happy to talk about I'm having some sort of mental health problem. But when it's like, I've been admitted to a hospital, people then still have that kind of, not everyone. No, some people are very, open and honest, but some people are like, that's something I want to keep for myself. And they have absolutely every right to do that, And I think we need to definitely shift our dial, because we get a lot of patients who are worried that their employers might treat them differently, and they shouldn't. Then legally, they cannot treat differently for having a mental health problem, but people still have that notion that I don't know. I mean, Kirsty, I think we talked about when I met you before about has been a huge spike in addiction cases with people working in the building industry, like the manual labour kind of trade. And unfortunately, Stu, this is us, because men, we're still not very good at expressing ourselves or talking. And I think the building industry itself is kind of quite a male-dominated environment. And I think that's something we need to focus on, is that people are talking, but maybe not the people we want to talk are not talking.
There is actually, there's a charity specifically set up for the construction industry, talking about male suicide.
Yeah.
I'll try and find the links. We can put it in the show notes.
Up until about 5 years ago, I was working as a project manager in the building trade,
right? Yeah.
And you would any sort of site meetings or any site accommodation, there was kind of posters and such there from such organisations, but I never saw anyone having conversations in and around how they were feeling. The posters were there, and it goes back to, I guess, what you were saying at the beginning. We all know it's there, and we all know that everybody's telling you it's all right to talk, but are people actually doing it?
Stu, do you mind if I ask you, Stu? Because I'm intrigued myself. I'm new to this kind of role, but was there a huge drug problem in the industry, or why is there such a huge drug and drink problem in that kind of industry?
It's really strange.
As opposed to like other industries, I don't know.
Well, my other industry is the nighttime economy. So.
Oh, right. So you probably see it both sides, but yeah.
But I don't know. I don't know if it's frustration. I don't know if it's maybe. I found that a lot of the people that I work with in that industry wanted to live a more glamorous life than what may be perceived as somebody that is working on a site. And it's it's a very honest living. It's a skilled living, and lots of people I work with had cars they couldn't afford, clothes they probably couldn't afford, and that would be supplemented by, in general, cocaine. And to the point where there will be people finishing work at 4 o'clock and straight to the pub on a Tuesday night, 3 or 4 pints and a few lines of cocaine, after work on a school night, which is problematic when it.
Well, I wonder, like, I think there's a few things going on. Like, interesting what you're saying. So one, you're right about the flash kind of lifestyle, but I think there's generally in building trade, there's a lot of cash and a lot of money flowing around, but it's only short lived. So you might get a project for a couple of weeks, and then next week you don't get a project. You know what I mean? So it's like precarious work. That's one thing, I guess. Also, you don't need DBS checks, right, to work on a building site. So you may have some people that may have been involved in criminality and things like that, and that's their kind of way to work. There is
regular drug testing on most big sites now. There's regular drug testing. I know multiple people that work on the railways, overnight and stuff like that, and there's stringent drug testing.
But I wonder, it does come back to a bit of a, like you say, like a lad culture. Like, we're all going out. Come on, why aren't you going out? And then before you know it, you kind of suck it into that thing. But absolutely, you're right. I mean, I'm of the same age as you. That back in my day, you'd never talk about your feelings or like you were sad or anything like that. It wouldn't come up. You would be mortified to kind of express that.
I don't think that lockdown has helped the situation with drugs either. Just in my other life, like searching people now when they arrive at whatever venue I'm at, I'm finding that the amount of generally cocaine that you're finding on people is far larger than what it was 3-4 years ago.
I think as we say in the industry, is that what happened was people had issues or problems. COVID and lockdown just turbocharged everything. Everybody was able to do whatever they were doing times 20. Because there was no boundaries, there was no going to work. It was very easy for people to get suckered into that lifestyle, and it just accentuated whatever was there. And I suppose that's the problem with addiction, is that whatever boundary you have, you'll break it, right? So it's like, oh well, I won't do it before 6 o'clock. You'll be doing it before 6 o'clock. I won't do it in front of the kids. You'll do it in front of the kids. Whatever boundary you've set in place for yourself, eventually it'll be knocked down.
Absolutely. Well, like I say, we'll put the show notes for the podcast so people can go and get stuck into it when they finish this. And John, it's been a real delight to talk to you and give us an insight into, and hopefully clarified anybody's sort of misconceptions of what your ward would be like. And
absolutely. And I would say I would encourage people to come and have a look. Just come and volunteer. come and be a HCA. There's loads of jobs out there. People want to become mental health support workers. You know, we don't have the facilities, and nursing as well. I'd strongly encourage anyone to be a mental health nurse.
And if people were interested in doing that, where would you direct them?
Well, the NHS website, get all the vacancies there, come for any of them. And the one thing I would say, sometimes people start work and they go, I'm not really liking this place is not for me. But there's hundreds of units, mental health units across the region of Essex and the UK. So don't stick, if you go in one place and this isn't for me, maybe it's not for you, try somewhere else.
Wonderful. Thanks ever so much for coming on today, John.
No, thank you,
John. It's been an absolute joy. Thank you.
Right, we're going to press stop, but don't go anywhere.
I won't go anywhere. I didn't want to mention